We are very glad to see all of you here this evening. We're going to be studying this whole week about what God has to say concerning worship and service. I believe that this is a timely subject because when we look in our world today, in the religious world, we see a lot of confusion about how we're to worship, what we are to do in worship, the kind of worship that we ought to have. We have all kinds. We have contemporary, we have traditional, and yet God's Word has not changed. And so we want to examine not what man is doing, but we want to examine what it is that God really says about worship and how He expects us to worship. Tonight we're going to be looking at, we need to get it right. We need to have it according to the will of God. Tomorrow night we'll be looking at God-given elements of worship, or the assembly. And the third lesson will be the nature of the worship assembly. And the lesson number 4 will be the passion of our assembly. And then the 5th lesson on Friday night, we will close that we are to be a living sacrifice unto God. Tonight we want to examine carefully the beginnings of worship. You know that worship has been a problem with mankind from nearly the beginning of time? That in the very beginning, when man started to worship God for the very first time, and they were going to offer sacrifice unto God, we find Cain and Abel as they are giving sacrifice unto God. And one of them, their sacrifice was unacceptable to God, and one was acceptable. Both of them had given the best of the fruit of the ground. Cain did. He was a farmer, and he gave of the first fruits unto God. And then his brother Abel was a keeper of sheep, and he gave of the flock unto God. God did not have favor or find favor with Cain's offering. Now, we're not told in the book of Genesis exactly why God did not favor the sacrifice that had been made by Cain. That his attempt at worship was unacceptable to God, we know, but the reason why is not always clear to us. But in examining the rest of the scriptures, we find that there is an element of worship, of sacrifice, that had to do with the blood. And his offering unto God failed to have that element. We would assume that he had been told what God expected of him because he told their parents what he expected of Adam and Eve. He had told us what he expects of us. He had commanded the children of Israel what he expected of them. And down through the patriarchs, we find that God specifically gave them instruction on those things that he wanted them to do. But for whatever reason, we find that not all sacrifice and not all worship was acceptable before God. And it led to violence. Because his was not accepted, Cain became angry. And it said that his countenance fell. And because of this separation from God, because his sacrifice had been rejected of God, we find that he talked with his brother in the field one day, and then he rose up and he slew his brother. We look at the children of Israel. And even though God had commanded them concerning the kind of worship and the kind of sacrifices that they were to give, that they looked around them at those people around them and they decided that they wanted to be like other people, and they began to offer sacrifice unto God in the same way as those people who were the remnant left in the land. And because of that, they were carried off into captivity. It was unacceptable to God. In Amos, the 5th chapter, if you have your Bible, we'd like for you to turn there. In Amos, the 5th chapter, we find instruction here concerning worship. He said, I hate and I despise your feast days, and I do not savor your sacred assemblies. Though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, nor will I regard your fatted peace offerings. Take away from me the noise of your songs, for I will not hear the melody of your stringed instruments. But let justice run down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream. God tells the people of Israel that their worship was unacceptable. Now we need to understand what we're talking about here, because you see, in the days of Amos, had God not commanded them concerning the feast days? And had he not given them instruction concerning these sacred assemblies that they were supposed to keep during the year? All of these were things that God had commanded, but they were not doing it in a way that was pleasing to God. They didn't get it right. And so their worship and their sacrifices were unacceptable to God. In fact, they are warned that if they didn't change, they were going to be rejected of God, and he was going to turn their land over to others, and they would be in captivity. It's imperative, if we're going to be pleasing unto God and be acceptable in his sight, that we get worship right, that we do it according to his will. Worship has never been about what we want to do or the way we want to do it. Remember two young men that were priests. In fact, they were in line to be high priest. Nadab and Abihu were sons of Aaron. They had been given special place, and on several occasions they were called with Moses and Aaron and Joshua to go up and be nearer to God than the people. They were given positions of prominence. But these two young men took it on themselves to offer unto God a strange fire, one that had not been commanded by God. And it says that God was fierce with them, and his anger came out against them, and the fire came out that they had made. This fire came out and consumed them, burned them up. And we are told that God commanded Aaron that he should not mourn them publicly, because the sacrifice that they had offered was in direct conflict with God's will, because he had not commanded it. It was not commanded of God. And because of that, he said they had disrespected God. When you and I do not worship God as he intends for us, we disrespect God. And if we disrespect God, he will judge us. And none of us can stand that judgment. Nadab and Abihu could not stand that judgment and live. They were consumed with that fire. You and I cannot survive if we do not honor God. But let us look at the scriptures in John chapter 4. Jesus here in John chapter 4, beginning in about verse 21, the setting of this story is Jesus traveling with his disciples, and he has had a long day's journey, and he finds himself in Samaria. And he is tired, and he sits down, and he is waiting for his disciples to go into town to get them something to eat and come back to him. And while he is there, he is talking to this woman at the well. And they began to discuss worship. You see, this woman brought it up because she wanted to change the subject. Jesus was talking to her about her personal life and the sin and the immorality that was in it. And she didn't want to talk about that, so she brought up the subject of worship. And she says, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet," verse 19, "and our fathers worship on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is a place where one ought to worship." And Jesus said unto her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshiper will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. For God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." Now, oftentimes we hear sermons preached, and I'm sure that the majority of you here have heard sermons preached concerning spirit and truth, and that we are going to do it from the heart, spirit, and according to God's will, truth. That is, both of those statements are correct statements. But that is not what Jesus is talking about in this particular place. You see, Jesus is talking about something that's going to change. Has God ever accepted worship that wasn't of the heart? He has never accepted worship that was not from the heart. Never. Has he ever accepted worship that wasn't according to his will and according to his commandments? And the answer again is no, it doesn't happen ever in Scripture. God does not accept any kind of offering, sacrifice, worship that is not according to his will. Never has. So what is being said here? What is going to change? And the change is that in the Old Testament, there was always an external place. Now, that external place might be nothing more than a dirt altar that was formed wherever they were at with whatever had happened special. Maybe they were going to go to war. You remember when Samuel offered sacrifice unto God, and they made an altar unto God, and they offer sacrifice to God, and they entreat God to be with them and bless them in their fight. On different occasions, they would gather up stones, and they would make an altar of these stones, and they would offer sacrifice unto God. When God instituted the tabernacle, he gave them commandments concerning the altar that they were to make, and all the details concerning that altar. And he told them that they were to sacrifice certain things in and on the altar. And then there were things that they were to sacrifice in the court of the tabernacle. And wherever the tabernacle was, that's where they were to offer those sacrifices. And when they came and built the temple, we find that God had commanded them, all of the Jews, that they would come back to Jerusalem twice a year to worship him in Jerusalem at the temple. There was a physical place. But he says to us, there's a time coming when there's not going to be a physical place necessarily. Just think for a moment. If God commanded us that on the first day of the week that we should gather in Jerusalem and take the Lord's Supper, how hard would that be for us here in America? God didn't do that. His church was going to be universal. There was going to be no physical place where all are expected to come and to worship God. But it would be told to us that we are the temple of God and that we worship God from within ourselves to God. Now, this does not negate the fact that he has commanded us to assemble. And we will talk more in some of the other lessons, in especially lesson 3 and 4, about the assembly and what God has said about our assembly as Christians. But here Jesus is talking about the nature of worship. And the nature of worship was going to be changed because there was going to be no physical place that God commanded them to worship, but that it was going to be from within. And it was going to have to be that which was true or genuine. It could not be just a put on. It was to be a genuine worship. And so what is it then that God really requires of us? What is it that He has shown to us is necessary for us to worship? You know, sometimes we use the word worship in a way that God has not used it. Many of us, when we talk about worship, are thinking about the assemblies such as we have right now tonight. That has never been worship. Turn with me to 2 Kings. I want you to look in 2 Kings chapter 17. We want to read verses 35 through 41. Read with me. We would encourage you to turn in your Bible. With whom the Lord hath made a covenant, and charged them, saying, You shall not fear other gods, nor bow down to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. But the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and an outstretched arm, Him you shall fear. Him you shall worship, and to Him you shall offer sacrifice. And the statutes, the ordinances, and the law, and the commandments which He wrote for you, you shall be careful to observe forever. You shall not fear other gods. And the covenant that I have made with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. But the Lord your God you shall fear, and He will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. However, they did not obey, but they followed their former rituals. So these nations feared the Lord, yet served their carved images, also their children and their children's children, having continually doing as their fathers did, even to this day. I want you to notice something important there. It is possible for us to fear the Lord, reverence Him, respect Him, claim Him, and acknowledge that He is God, and still fail to worship Him. That's important. And the reason that is important, are we not told that even the devils believed in Jesus and confessed Him as Lord? But they were not worshipers. They feared Him. They said, What do we have to do with you, Jesus? They feared Him, they honored Him, they respected Him, they even obeyed Him, but they did not worship Him. It is possible for us to fear God and yet fail to worship God. In verse 33, I want you to listen. He said, They feared the Lord, yet served their own gods according to the rituals of the nations from whom they were carried away. They feared God, but they did not worship Him. They did not serve Him. They did not sacrifice acceptably to Him. In context here in 2 Kings, there was one benefit. Their fearing of the Lord, their respecting Him as being the God of all creation and acknowledging that He was all-powerful, kept the lions from coming into their cities and destroying them. That's what was happening. You see, they had displaced the Israelites. The Assyrians had. They had displaced them. And in their place, they had gotten people from all different places on the earth and put them in the middle of the promised land. And because of their idolatry, God had brought lions in among them that killed and destroyed the people, and it was such a bad problem that they began to complain to the government and says, "We cannot live here." Said, "The lions are too bad. We cannot live here." And so they said, "We need to get a priest that we took out of that land and send him back there and let him teach the people how to fear the God of that land." And so this priest comes back and he tries to tell them concerning God. And they believed the message that he preached to an extent, so they feared the Lord. And from every class they appointed for themselves priests of the high places who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. They feared God, they acknowledged that he was God, but they continued to worship and to do exactly like they had been doing. But there was one benefit. The lions did quit eating the people. But they were still unacceptable before God. Let's notice 4 things that are mentioned here that oftentimes when we talk about worship, we have combined all of them together, and when we're talking about fearing God, we talk about worship. And when we talk about worshiping God, we're talking about service, or things that we do, or the manner in which we do them, the elements of our worship. He breaks it down into 4 things. First of all, he says there is the fear of the Lord. We have to honor God. We have to believe with all of our heart that he is the creator of all things, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. We must have faith in God. And then he said, "Him shall you worship." The word worship, when we examine it carefully, means to bow ourselves down before, or to prostrate ourselves. It is possible for us to fear God, but not worship him. It's possible for us to fear God and even prostrate ourselves before him and not offer acceptable sacrifice. You see, Cain feared God. He believed God was the creator of all things. He believed that God was worthy of worship and honor. And he offered unto God sacrifice, but it was unacceptable. His sacrifice was not according to what God would accept. And so part of what we call worship is the sacrifice. To him you shall offer sacrifices. There are many different kinds of sacrifices that God has called us to offer. But for tonight's lesson, we need to understand these 4 separations. That it's possible for us to do one or more of them and still not be acceptable in the sight of God, not doing according to his will. He said you also have to keep the statutes and ordinances and law and commandments, and be careful to observe forever these things. You see, when we talk about worship, we need to understand that it begins with us respecting God and believing that he is the creator of all things, and that whatever he asks of us is good. And it involves us humbling ourselves before Him, prostrating ourselves before God. And we cannot do that in pride and arrogance. It is in humility that we can do this. And we must offer sacrifice. That without sacrifice, we cannot worship God. We cannot honor God. We cannot be obedient in the sight of God. And God has always asked of us something. It was very simple in the days of Adam and Eve. The service He asked of them, the sacrifice that He asked of them, was that they should till the ground, keep the garden, and that they should refrain from eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They walked with God, and because they had not sinned, there was no prostrating themselves before God. He walked with them in the midst of the garden. It wasn't until sin entered into the garden that they were afraid of God. And they hid themselves. Since sin came into the world, acceptable worship involved those four things: a fear of the Lord, a bowing down or a worship of God, an offering of sacrifice, a keeping of statutes, ordinances, laws, commandments, continually as long as we live. That has been God's pattern always. From the beginning, it has been God's pattern. So the third thing that we want to look at tonight is, what is then the nature of true worship? What is its nature? What does God say? Because we could spend a lot of time and getting ready for these lessons. I've listened to lots of lessons that are on CDs and from different sources. Some of them not members of the church. Some of them were supposed to be members of the church. But when you talk about worship, the ideas and the concepts are all over the page. There was one that said everything that we do is worship. Everything that we do is worship. And so because everything that we do is worship, then I can worship God wherever. I don't have to have a place to worship God. Well, part of that is true. We don't have a specific place that God has commanded us to worship. But the follow-through was that I can worship God just as well in my boat fishing as I can if I assemble. In fact, when I assemble with religion, and they put quotations around that, he said, then I am not able to worship as well as when I am off by myself. I'm distracted. And so their contention was that we worship God 24/7, and that there was no difference. So anything that I could do any other time, I could do any time. Therefore, I could take the Lord's Supper whenever I wanted to, because I was worshiping God 24/7. And God is not a God of laws and commandments anymore. He's a God of love. We could go on and on about what people have said, but let's see what God has to say. Turn with me to 2 Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles chapter 7 is where we want to start. and verse 14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and heal their land. So what is it that God says was the nature of true worship? He said, if my people will call on my name with humility. You see, in Luke, we're shown two men that go to the temple to worship. One a Pharisee and one a tax collector. The Pharisee saw that tax collector over there coming to worship, and he said, you know, I am so glad that I'm not like that man over there. And it says that he prayed with himself. You see, when we are puffed up with ourselves, when we're filled with pride, we can't pray to God, we can't sing to God, we can't offer sacrifice to God, we cannot worship God. It's an impossibility. True worship involves us humbling ourselves before God. Just think for a moment how it would change our assemblies if every one of us came knowing that we were sinners and that we were needful of what God could do for us that day. Would it not change our assemblies if every one of us came in like that? Oftentimes we just have a checklist. We sang, we prayed. You know, they didn't sing enough songs. Said, what happened to that song leader? And we complain about the fact that we didn't sing enough songs. Or we sang too many songs. Or did you hear that prayer so-and-so play? It was 15 minutes long. You see, our assembly is about us seeing God and seeing His mercy and seeing His grandeur and seeing His awesome nature and our frailties and our need to be where He is. You see, when we really understand the true nature of worship, it's not a difficult task to get those that are true believers to attend the assembly of the saints. Because they want to be there in the presence of their God to receive from Him strength and forgiveness and mercy and blessings. We're going to talk about the fact that the nature of the Christian life is mountaintop and valley. The labor, the work, the service, it's in the valley. And it's hard. We have the devil trying to get us. We have those that we work with every day trying to hinder us. We have the world itself sucking the vitality and our energy and our time and absorbing all of those things and telling us those are the most important things. And it's difficult to walk the Christian life in this world. And when we serve God 6 days in the world, then we're going to long for that day of rest where we can come and prostrate ourselves before our God and receive healing and strength and mercy and blessings in our times of trouble. Humility is necessary. We must humble ourselves before God. And then look with me in Chronicles 33, or 2 Chronicles 33. Here we find in the life of one of the kings, a king, his name is Manasseh. Beginning in verse 9, it says, Manasseh seduced Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. Here is a man who has supposed to be the king of God's people, but he has led them astray, and he has seduced them and caused them to sin against God in a way and more than any of the nations that had been in the land before God displaced them. And the Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they would not listen. They would not humble themselves before God. They would not submit to the will of God. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze fetters, and carried him off to Babylon. Now when he was in affliction, I want you to get this. When he was in affliction, he implored the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. Notice what he has done. He has learned to fear the Lord. And now he has prostrated himself before God and acknowledged in humility that he should not have rebelled against God. And he seeks the forgiveness of God. And God is just and faithful to forgive. Why do we want to come and worship? Because it is in that condition when we fear God and we prostrate ourselves before God and we plead for his blessing of forgiveness that we can be forgiven. James would tell us that we confess our sins one to another and we pray one for another. And I tell you, we'll talk more about that in later lessons. Tonight, what we want to see is that this king found that it was important to fear God, to humble himself before God, and to seek the forgiveness of God, that he might offer unto God acceptable sacrifice. And he prayed to him, and he received his entreat, that which he prayed for, he heard his supplication, and brought him back to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. You see, when he worshiped God and God responded, it said he knew that God was, or the Lord was, God. And what did he begin to do? He began to do right things. We cannot worship God in true worship and not do right things. If we continue to do wrong things, we're like those people that we read just a few moments ago in 2 Kings. They feared God, but they didn't serve Him. And so he began to build the wall outside of the city. And he began to enclose the gates of Jerusalem. And he raised it to a very great height. Then he put military captains in all the fortified cities. He took away the foreign gods and the idols from the house of the Lord and all the altars that he had built. When you and I are willing to worship honestly and righteously before God, then our past mistakes can be forgiven. How many of us need that? That's how many of us need worship. And to do it in accordance with God's will. But you know, we keep reading there in 2 Chronicles. And he had a son, Amon. He was 22 years old when he became king. He reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. But he did evil in the sight of the Lord, as his father Manasseh had done. For Ammon sacrificed all the carved images which his father Manasseh had made and served them. And he did not humble himself before the Lord as his father Manasseh had humbled himself. But Amon trespassed more and more. Then his servants conspired against him and killed him in his own house. It does matter how we worship God and whether we worship Him at all. We must humble ourselves before Him. In the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 57, I want you to turn with me. In verse 15, for thus saith the high and lofty one, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy, I dwell in the high and holy place, with him who has a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. Who is it that can be in the presence of God? And he says, those that will humble themselves. Jesus in John chapter 14 says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And my Father will love you, and He will come in and He will sup with you. You see, without humility, it's impossible to be a Christian. It's impossible to please God. It's impossible to receive forgiveness of sin. And sometimes our pride and arrogance is not so much demonstrated against God as it is demonstrated against God's people, those that God loves. And John would tell us that if we cannot love one another, we cannot love God. We cannot be acceptable in the eyes of God. You see, when we are humbled before God in the right way, we're not going to be fault finders. In fact, he tells us in Galatians chapter 6 that if we see a brother overcome or overtaken in a fault, he said, you which are spiritual, strive to restore such a one. You see, we're not fault finders. We're not finger pointers. If we have humbled ourselves before God, then we act differently to one another. we respond differently to one another. James and Peter both write to us about humility. And we close this session of these lessons with reading in 1 Peter chapter 5, beginning with verse 5. He said, "Likewise, you younger, submit yourself to the elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he might exalt you in due time." You see, to everyone that would want to be exalted of God, to hear him say, "Well done, thou good and faithful." If you want to hear that, then you will worship God. You will fear him. You will prostrate yourself before him. You will offer sacrifices to him according to his statutes, his ordinance, his laws, his commandments. And you'll continue in that as long as you live on this earth. Let's pray. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we come before your throne and we thank you for the time that you have allowed us to have here on this earth and in this period of time of study. We pray, Father, that the things that we have read from your word, that we understood them as you would have us to understand them, that everything that we have done and said is in accordance with your will. We pray, Father, that you might help us meditate on the things that you have written, that we might be guided to a closer walk with thee, that we might be a part of the redeemed for the ages. Father, we pray that you would be with those that have assembled here tonight, that you would give them safe journeys back to their homes. And Father, if it be your will and you bless us with another opportunity that we might assemble ourselves to study more from your word in the days to come. This, Father, is our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. This concludes this section of our lesson tonight. If you got notifications in the mail, we are going to have a short question and answer session if there are any questions. If you are asking a question about any of the material that has been presented tonight, I will do my very best to answer those questions. If you have other questions that I did not deal with, but you thought of while we were talking about those things, I may have to just write them down and answer them tomorrow night in our question and answer session. But feel free at this time to raise your hand and ask questions of the things that we have talked about or ideas of worship that we may not have touched on that you wanted us to. Don't be bashful. I'll try to do my best to answer your questions. Yes? Well, any time that God commanded man to do anything, no matter how simple it was, if man did not do that, God rejected him. And we have example, Adam and Eve. God gave them very simple instructions. They didn't do it. They listened to the devil instead, and so they were cast out of the garden. There was consequences that were paid because they had disrespected the will of God. God's word, to disrespect or not obey his word, is to reject his word. If we reject his word, we have rejected the one that gave the word. And so it is a disrespect of God for us to worship God in our own way. He said, why do you call on me, Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? The implication is always our obedience is in direct response to how much we honor and respect God. If we think that God won't know, won't find out, and there have been people that thought that they could hide from God. Do you remember a man named Jonah? He thought he could hide from God. When he wasn't doing what God commanded, even though he was a prophet of God, he was dishonoring God. God brought a storm up and is going to sink a whole ship and everybody in it, because one man had disrespected his God. And when they found out that Jonah had done that, they threw him overboard. Because that's what he told them to do. He said, if you want to spare yourself, you're going to have to chunk me over. They didn't want to do that, but God proved that that's what it was going to happen. If they continued to disrespect him by keeping Jonah in the ship, they all were going to go down with that ship. Is this kind of what you had in mind? Yes, the world's concept of worship is that as long as I'm doing worship of any kind, as long as I am doing worship things such as singing or praying or giving alms, that if I'm doing any of those things, it doesn't matter how I do them or when I do them or anything about it. If I'm doing those things, it ought to be acceptable to God. But in all of those cases, alms and prayers, it does matter. If we do these things to be seen of men, he said there's no value to them. What about Cornelius? Here was a man who offered prayers unto God. He was a man who was benevolent, not only to his own, but to his enemies. And yet, he is told that he needed to have words or find out from Peter what he needed to do that he could have acceptable worship to God, to be acceptable in the sight of God. It's not enough for us just to do what we think is worship. Anytime that God has specified what he wants of us, it is totally disrespectful of God not to do it. As parents, we understand that. Now, I don't know why it seems that we can't understand that in our relationship to God. If we tell one of our children, says, I want you to be in by 10 o'clock, and they don't show up, do we say, oh, well, that's all right, it doesn't really matter, that was just a ballpark figure that I had out there? We don't think that way. If we told them that we wanted them in by 10 o'clock and they didn't show up at 10 o'clock, and if there was providentially hindered, they in the hospital, they rolled their vehicle, whatever, that made it impossible for them to be there. But if they had a possibility to be there and they didn't show up, we believe that they have been disrespectful of us. And that's true. That's what has happened. If there was no commandment, then we could not disrespect him if he had given us no commandment. But he has given us commandment on what he wants us to do in terms of worship and how to worship him. And so for us to do anything less is to set ourselves against God. Any other questions? We have refreshments. I was going to wait and not tell you about those until after there was no more questions, so that you would ask your questions and not just be wanting to go and eat the good things that the ladies have prepared, but there are refreshments prepared in the fellowship area off of this hall. And if you would like to be a part of that, we would encourage you to go at this time. And we hope to see you back tomorrow night when we will be talking about God-given elements of our assemblies. And so we will talk about that.